April 16, 2014, a South Korean passenger ferry suddenly capsized in coastal water. The rescue should have been relatively straightforward, but a series of outrageous mistakes by South Korea turned the accident into a disaster.
아 기울어졌어. 야 나 좀 살려줘.
나 무서워. 나 살고 싶어.
어른들 다 먹고 있는 사이에 애들 얼마나 무섭겠어요. 안에서 제발 좀 살려주세요.
보이지도 않아 배가. 어떡해. 안 보여 배가 안 보여.
On the afternoon of April 15, 2014, 325 teachers and students from Dunwon High School arrived at Incheon Port. They were preparing to board the Sewol Ferry for a 4-day graduation trip to Jeju Island. The ship had originally been built in June 1994 by a shipyard in Nagasaki, Japan. At that time, it was called the ferry Naminu. After being retired in 2012, it was purchased by South Korea's Chonghaejin Marine Company and converted into a passenger ferry. They renamed the ship Sewol, meaning to transcend the world, a name with strong religious significance. The Sewol mainly traveled back and forth between Incheon Port and Jeju Island, with 3 round trips per week. It carried passengers and transport cargo. The Sewol was scheduled to depart at 6:30 p.m., but due to heavy fog, the Korean Shipping Association cancelled all sailing. However, 2 hours later, the Incheon Vessel Traffic Service withdrew the low visibility warning. At around 9 p.m., they received clearance to leave port. It was also the only ship to leave the harbor that night. There were 476 people on board, including 443 passengers and 33 crew members. There were also 2,142 tons of cargo. The captain was Lee Jun-seok, 69 years old, with 40 years of experience. Strictly speaking, he was the acting captain. The original captain, Shin Sang-chil, had been suspended by Chonghaejin Marine for reporting the company's illegal structural modifications. That was why Lee Jun-seok became the acting captain. After the ship departed, the Danwon High School students were super excited. They first gathered in the central hall on the 3rd floor to play games, then went out to the deck to watch fireworks. Nothing unusual happened on the first night. Then time came to 7:30 the next morning. Third mate Park Honjail and helmsman Jo Junji took over their shift. The Sewol was traveling at 20 knots. An hour later, the Sewol entered the Mengol Channel area. The water temperature there was around 12 degrees Celsius, and some areas had strong currents and reefs. Although the Sewol was not passing directly through those areas, the third mate still instructed the helmsman to switch the steering system from autopilot to manual control. At that time, 3 people were in control room: the quartermaster, the helmsman, and third mate. The captain, meanwhile, was resting in his room. The 3rd floor had a few passengers eating breakfast. It looked like a completely ordinary morning. But at 8:47, the ship suddenly began to tilt violently to the left. In less than 2 minutes, the angle of heel went from 10 degrees to 30 degrees. Many passengers were injured in the collisions. After a few minutes, the captain evacuated engine room crew. As for the cabin's passenger, communications officer Kang Hae-dol ordered them to stay still. That announcement was repeated more than 10 times afterward.
야 미쳤나봐. 이런 상황에서 막 그러지 않냐? 안전하니까 가만히 있으라고. 그런 거 주는 거야. 영어 왜다 그러잖아. 그 지하철도 그렇잖아. 안전하니까 좀만 있어달라고 했는데 지하철도 써야겠어.
우리 진짜로 이만큼 비운 거야. 진짜야 이거.
나가 사람들은 살고.
The Sewol's crew immediately descended into chaos. They rushed to their quarters to collect their belongings and escape. Not one of them thought of calling for help. After arriving at control room, the captain also told the passengers not to move. This caused many students to believe it was only a minor accident. They obediently stayed where they were. Some were chatting and some even started fooling around. However, a 17-year-old boy named Choi Dioka noticed something was wrong. At 8:52, which was 5 minutes after the ship began tilting, he used his cell phone to call 119 for help. This was also the first distress message the Sewol sent to the outside world. The call was answered by the Jeollanam-do Fire Department.
살려주세요. 배가 침몰된 것 같아요. 배가 침몰해요? 여기 제주도 가고 있었는데 예. 여기 지금 배가 떨어져서 떨어진 것 같아요 지금. 잠깐만요. 자, 지금 타고 보신 배가 침몰한다는 소리예요? 아니면 옆에 있는 다른 배가 침몰한다는 소리예요? 배가 침몰한 배가요.
위치 말해주세요. 위치 배가 어디 있습니까?
위치를 잘 모르겠어요 지금 여기가.
위치를 모른다고요? 거기 뭐 그 GPS 경위도 안 나오나요? 경도하고 미도? 새 이름이 뭡니까, 새 이름?
최월후요, 최월후.
The fire department then transferred the call to the Mokpo Coast Guard, but the Coast Guard thought he was a crew member, so they repeatedly asked him to provide the ship's coordinates. But Choi looked around, and there was not a single crew member in sight. Soon after, the phone signal was cut off. The call lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds. 3 minutes after Choi reporting, Sewol's first mate finally sent out a distress call. By then, 8 minutes has passed since the tilting. During the 12 minutes that followed, the crew of the Sewol did absolutely nothing except wait for rescue. During that time, the captain had 5 phone calls with their company, but neither the captain nor Chonghae-jin Marine discussed organizing an evacuation of the students.
아 기울어졌어. 야 나 좀 살려줘.
At 9:07, a nearby ship called the Tola Ace immediately head over after discovering the capsized Sewol. But because the Sewol was drifting with the current and no one had come out of the ship, there were not even any people visible on the deck. They did not know the situation on board, so they did not dare approach recklessly. At 9:10, the Jindo Vessel Traffic Service asked the Sewol crew how the passengers on board were doing, but no one answered. 2 minutes later, they asked again whether the passengers had all boarded the lift-rafts. The Sewol's first mate finally replied, saying no, there are too many people on this ship. The lift rafts can't hold them all. But in fact, the Sewol had 44 lifeboats and 4 marine evacuation systems on board, enough for 2,100 people in total. As long as they had begun evacuating passengers, everyone could have survived.
이거 상황이 아니야. 이거 실제라고.
야, 누구 구명조끼 뭐 할 거야, 알아?
와 기울 줄은 상상도 못했다.
At 9:23, after waiting for 16 minutes, Tola Ace's captain could not hold back any longer. He told the Jindo Vessel Traffic Service, "We're right next to them. If the passengers evacuate now, we can rescue them immediately. Please notify them to evacuate at once." So the Jindo Vessel Traffic Service contacted the Sewol again, but the first mate said, "Our broadcasting system is malfunctioning. We can't notify the passengers." The people at the traffic service anxiously replied that, "Even if you cannot make announcements, please send someone to inform them." The first mate asked, "If the passengers evacuated now, will they get rescued?" The traffic service immediately gave a definite yes.
아, 나 무서워. 아, 나 살고 싶어. 아, 진짜.
But even 5 minutes after the call ended, not a single person had come out of the Sewol. Inside, the Not to Move amusement was still being played. At around 9:30, Captain Lee Junseok came and evacuate the crew. As for the passengers, no one cared.
여기 세월호입니다. 감도 있습니까? 세월호 진도관을 모의겠습니다. 그 인명 탈출시키는 거는 그 선장님께서 지금 직접 판단하셔갖고 지금 판단을 빠르게 하셔갖고 지금 하시죠.
2 minutes later, Mokpo Coast Guard patrol vessel 123 arrived. At that time, the angle of tilt had already reached 52 degrees, but for some reason, the Coast Guard also did not urge the passengers to come out. At 9:35, the Coast Guard helicopter arrived, but just like patrol vessel 123, they did not tell the students to evacuate. They simply circled above the vessel. By this time, more and more water had poured into the ship, and the vessel had tilted to 62 degrees. Trying to crawl out of the ship was already extremely difficult.
사람들 하나 안 보이네요 지금. 사람들 아니 안에 사람들 한 명도 안 보여요. 사람들 그러면 바다에 뛰어내릴 사람도 있어요. 바다에 사람이 하나 없습니다. 바다에도 사람 안 보이고. 네네. 무조건 심심한데 계속 보고 가세요. 네 알겠습니다. 예.
선장은 뭐 알길래?
At 9:46, after being urged by the Coast Guard, Patrol Vessel 123 finally sent a rubber boat, but they were not going to rescue the passengers, just the captain and crewmates. When rescued, they also did not ask the Coast Guard to rescue the passengers. They only cared about escaping themselves. They did not even turn off the announcements. After rescuing the captain and the others, a Coast Guard officer climbed in to rescue the remaining crew members. This was their last opportunity to call for an evacuation, but neither the crew nor the Coast Guard who had arrived did so. After rescuing the crew, the Coast Guard never approached the Sewol again. They merely circled around the ship, watching it sink little by little. At 9:54, some of the passengers who had disobeyed instructions finally climbed out. They were then picked up by the Coast Guard helicopter. The Coast Guard's attitude was obvious. Whoever can get out will be rescued, but they will not risk their lives to organize an evacuation.
근데 물어봐야 되지 않나요? 사람도 없어요 이렇게 구조하실 때. 그 나온 사람만 건드는 게 아니라 뭐 물어봐야 되지 않나요?
옆에서 말을 해도 하물며 어떤 올라갈 때 조심하라고 자세 사람이.
아니 그거는 알겠는데 그 사람들 상황은 알겠는데 지금 구조템 구조하시는 입장에서는 제주 있는 확인해야 되는 인구 같은 게 아닌가.
제가 물어본 것 같아. 근데
At 10:04, Park Sung-ji-ai, an instructor of South Korea Fisheries Management Corps, learned about what had happened to the Sewol. He immediately took a body camera and rushed to the rescue. When he arrived at the scene, he found quite a few ships gathered nearby, but for some reason not a single one was going over to help. Later he learned that those ships had seen the Coast Guard vessels not approaching. Thus, they thought there was some issue, so everyone just stayed on standby. Some said the Coast Guard did not allow them to approach, but Park Sung-ji ignored all of that. He drove his vessel straight to the stern and began the rescue. Afterward, statistics showed that his ship alone rescued 28 people. Because Park Sung-ji-ai was operating a government vessel with warning lights mounted, the surrounding people thought it was an official rescue vessel, so they all followed him over. That misunderstanding allowed more students to be rescued. But at that point, something incomprehensible happened at the scene. Not only did the Coast Guard fail to assist with the rescue, they used loudspeakers to drive away approaching vessels. At 10:21, less than 2 hours after the accident occurred, the Sewol had completely capsized. The cabin section was fully below the surface of the sea. Escaping from inside the ship was impossible. The last student to be rescued was Park Jan-hyuk. The one who saved him was Park Sung-ji, the very first to approach. At that point, there was 172 survivors. Majority had been rescued by fishing boats. There was still 304 people inside the ship. If they had continued the rescue operation, quite a few more could still have been saved.
예, 지금 여객선에 우리 항공 구조단이 못 내려갑니까?
아직 못 내리고 앞에 선수만 남아있다던데 지금은 내릴지 못할 것 같습니다.
아까 진작 좀 내렸다고 그림이 됐어야 되는데 지금 그게 문제란 말이에요. 못 올라가면 우리가 올라가고 유도한 게 보여줬어야 되는데 승객들은 거의 다 나왔어요. 배에서?
예.
그러면 대부분 다 나왔다는 얘기예요? 선생님 없다는 이야기예요?
예, 그 전부터 계속 기울리면서부터 사람이 나와 있었기 때문에
네.
내부 수색은 정확하게 안 했는데
네.
거의 다 나간 걸로 지금 확인이 되는.
그러면은 선내리다 사람들이 거의 없는 걸로 봐야 되네요.
예.
As the people at the Airborne Rescue Service Center said, they really should feel ashamed. And what was even more baffling was that the authorities then falsely announced that no one was missing. Major media outlets also reported the same thing, till as late as 11:26. The Korean broadcasting system was still reporting all of the students had been safely rescued. These false reports caused rescue organizations to misjudge the situation, so they didn't bring rescue equipment immediately. It also left the waiting families wavering constantly between hope and despair. The families were gathered in a gymnasium on Jindo Island. First they heard officials say everyone was rescued, and then next, they heard people from the scene say no one was being rescued. The families did not know whom to believe, nor whether their children were dead or alive. A sense of despair filled the entire gymnasium. South Korea President Park Geun-hye already knew about the incident at 10 a.m., but no one knew where she went in the next 7 hours. Some say she went for a skin treatment. Afterwards, she went to rest in her room. At 5:15 in the afternoon, she finally appeared at the rescue meeting.
이렇게 구명조끼를 학생들은 입었다고 하는데 그렇게 발견하기가 힘듭니까 지금요?
갇혀 있기 때문에 구명조끼가 의미가 크게 없는 것 같습니다. 그래서 지금 상태에서
It seems that the president have no clue what is going on. After 9 p.m., the families left the gymnasium and headed for Pyeongmookport. But even when they got there, they could not do anything. As time passed second by second, many family members began to break down.
우리만 따뜻하면 뭐하냐고요. 애들이 추운데 우리만 따뜻하면 뭐하냐고.
Because no one was telling them the latest rescue situation, they gathered and rented a boat to go and check on the situation. But when those people returned, they learned there was still no rescue operation happening there either.
민간인들은 들어간대. 근데 경찰은 못 들어간대. 민간인은 들어간대. 민간인 잠수부들은 들어가는데 경찰은 못 들어간대. 아까 낮에도 자기네들이 유리창이라도 깨가지고 한 사람이라도 구하려고 그랬더니 경찰이 못 깨겠다는 거예요. 그거를. 그 부분에 대해서 좀 밝혀주세요 좀.
어른들 밥 먹고 있는 사이에 애들 얼마나 무섭겠어요 저 안에서. 제발 좀 알려주세요.
Under multiple requests from the families, the Coast Guard finally agreed to send a group of family members to the scene to see. When they arrived at the sinking site, it was the first time they saw the Sewol. At that moment, the sea was as calm as a lake, with no wind or waves at all. Yet there was no rescue operations carried out. They kept holding endless meetings and discussions. The golden rescue window after the sinking was wasted, just like that.
사람이 사람이 살아있다고 감독이 왔대. 빨리 구해줘. 좀 가서 작업하는 인원 있어? 힘든 건 알지만 좀 해줄 것 좀 해야 되는 거 아니에요? 이거 지금 아무도 안 하고 있으면 어떡해요?
문제가 있어요. 미쳤어. 오빠.
야 나도 한번 그거 지켜봐.
Early the next morning, officials from the Blue House once again went to Pongmok port for show. To some extent, this affected the rescue effort, as they had to receive and report to them. In fact, the rescue teams were also putting on a show. It was for the Korean public, and the other was for their superiors. In the morning, South Korean Prime Minister came to offer condolences, but when he saw how emotional the families were, he did not dare speak with them. After answering reporters' questions, he tried to leave, but was immediately surrounded by furious family members. It was hectic. In the end, under police protection, he fled the scene. After the Prime Minister left, Park Geun-hye came. The family was more calm as she was the president. They pleaded with the president to pressure the rescue teams.
전에 구조 현장을 다녀왔는데 정부가 동원할 수 있는 모든 자원과 인력을 동원해서 수색에 지금 최선을 다하고 있습니다.
말씀하신 대로 저희는 어떤 여건에서도 이제 인력을 하고 작사 500여 명을 지금 충족하고 있습니다.
What was unexpected was when Commissioner of Korea Coast Guard said there were more than 500 divers. Everyone's anger was reignited once again. Park Geun-hye then quickly promised that she would personally oversee the ongoing rescue and investigate the cause of the accident to punish those responsible. Then, under the protection of her bodyguards, she hurriedly left, but the government's rescue operation did not improve much. Apart from retrieving large numbers of bodies, they did not rescue a single survivor. The Coast Guard publicly claimed they had already pumped air into the hull, but that too was later confirmed to be a lie. The equipment they spent 2 days bringing in was meant for commercial use. If used, it would produce large amounts of harmful gas. So in the end, it did nothing. At 11:50 a.m. on April 18th, which was the fourth day after the cruise sank, the Sewol completely disappeared beneath the surface. Along with it sank the hopes of hundreds of families.
보이지도 않아 배가. 안 보여 배가.
In fact, throughout the entire situation, the US, Japan, and China military all offered assistance with rescue efforts, but South Korea refused. The reason given was that this incident did not require special aid. After the Sewol had sunk, South Korea formed a special investigation unit to investigate the accident. The conclusions fell into the following categories. 1. Improper crew operation, which caused the ship to make a sudden turn. 2. Cargo overload, which raised the ship's center of gravity. 3. Insufficient ballast water, reducing the vessel's ability to regain stability. 4. Improper modifications that affected the vessel's stability. 5. Poor workmanship, which accelerated the ship's sinking. 6. Inadequate crew training by Chung Haejin Marine. 7. A possible mechanical fault in the rudder. 8. Watertight doors not being closed, which led to rapid capsizing. 9. Emergency distress signals not functioning properly, which affected rescue speed. 10. Cargo not being properly secured. And those were the reasons given by the South Korean authorities. But the public had different opinion, and there were many of them. Example, submarine collision theory, the deliberate bumping theory, the sacrifice theory, the covert collision theory. But whether official or civilian, there was one point on which everyone agreed. This accident was entirely man-made. A rescue operation that should have gone smoothly turned into a disaster because of the incompetence of some South Korean departments. It is hard to believe this was done by a developed country. South Korean prosecutors immediately began pursuing accountability. A total of 399 people was investigated, of which 178 were detained and charged. But in the end, only 53 people were convicted in the final ruling. Captain Lee Jun-seok was sentenced to life imprisonment for murder. Chief Mate Kong Won-sik 12 years. Second Mate Kim Yoon-ho 7 years. Chief Engineer Park Ji-ho 10 years. Third Mate Park Han-jail 5 years. Helmsman Jo Junj-by 5 years. 15 crew members were charged. Kim Kyung-hil, Captain of Coast Guard, Patrol Vessel 223, which was the first to arrive at. He was jailed 3 years for negligence causing death. Also penalized were Chung Haejin Marine, the Coast Guard, the Ministry of Oceans and Fisheries, the Korean Shipping Association, the Jindo Vessel Traffic Service, and many other departments. But this outcome did not calm the anger of the Korean people. Calls for the impeachment of Park Geun-hye grew louder. 2017, March 10th, the Constitutional Court, over events involving corruption, abuse of power, upheld her impeachment and removed her from the presidency. 2 weeks after she stepped down, salvaging Sewol finally began. By then, 3 years had already passed since the sinking. China's salvage team led the operation. Between March 22nd and April 11th, 2017, they used the crane vessel Genhua 32 first lift the Sewol out of the water, then transported it to Mokpo, Newport. The hull still remained at the same 90-degree portside tilt, and when the ship arrived at the port, the South Korean government barred victims' families from approaching. Over the next 7 months, South Korea began inspecting the Sewol. They found a large number of the victims' mobile phones and personal belongings inside the ship, and recovered a great deal of video footage from them. The remains of 4 missing persons were also found in the cabins, but 5 missing persons still has not yet been found. It is worth mentioning that, during the salvage process, a large number of animal remains were discovered. This bizarre phenomenon triggered even more conspiracy theories. As for why so many students did not escape when the ship was sinking, some Western media attributed the cause to Korea's culture of age hierarchy. For example, the Los Angeles Times said that this disaster made the Confucian culture of respecting elderly especially glaring. The Dallas Morning News believed that if those had been a group of American students, they would have used any means possible to get off that ship. But in Asian culture, everyone must obey the demands of the group, which makes following rules seem extremely important. Only Time magazine offered a different view. They believed this accident should not be blamed on culture, because the structural problems of the South Korean government were the main culprit in the disaster. Personally, I strongly agree with Time magazine's view. Using this isolated South Korean incident to broaden criticism of all Asian culture is itself another form of arrogance. After all, South Korea's absurd action, it's extremely rare, even in Asia. Friends, what do you think? Alright, that's where today's video ends. Thank you for watching.